Last week we mentioned how in Joshua and Judges we see this entry of the people into the land and how it's a gradual process by which they conquer the land, which will probably become complete in between the times of Samuel and David. And how in both Joshua and Judges, the themes of God's faithfulness and the people's disobedience are present. We might say in Joshua, the emphasis is on God's faithfulness and the people's disobedience is more in the background. And how to a certain extent in Judges, it's a slightly different relationship. There's a much greater emphasis on the people's disobedience, but still a stress that God is faithful. In fact, much of the message of Judges could be summarized in terms of God being faithful, even though the people are disobedient. Chapter 2 provides us with quite an accurate summary of the whole story of the book of Judges.
After Joshua had dismissed the Israelites, they went to take possession of the land, each to their own inheritance. The people served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and of the elders who outlived him and who had seen all the great things the Lord had done for Israel. Joshua son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110, and they buried him in the land of his inheritance, at Timnath-Heres in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gaash. After that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. They forsook the Lord, the God of their ancestors, who had brought them out of Egypt. They followed and worshipped various gods of the peoples around them. They aroused the Lord's anger because they forsook him and served Baal and the Ashtoreths. In his anger against Israel, the Lord gave them into the hands of raiders who plundered them. He sold them into the hands of their enemies all around, whom they were no longer able to resist. Whenever Israel went out to fight, the hand of the Lord was against them to defeat them, just as he had sworn to them. They were in great distress. Then the Lord raised up judges, who saved them out of the hands of these raiders. Yet they would not listen to their judges but prostituted themselves to other gods and worshipped them. They quickly turned from the ways of their ancestors, who had been obedient to the Lord's commands. Whenever the Lord raised up a judge for them, he was with the judge and saved them out of the hands of their enemies as long as the judge lived. For the Lord relented because of their groaning under those who oppressed and afflicted them. But when the judge died, the people returned to ways even more corrupt than those of their ancestors, following other gods and serving and worshipping them. They refused to give up their evil practices and stubborn ways. Therefore the Lord was very angry with Israel and said, "Because this nation has violated the covenant I ordained for their ancestors and has not listened to me, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations Joshua left when he died. I will use them to test Israel and see whether they will keep the way of the Lord and walk in it as their ancestors did." The Lord had allowed those nations to remain. He did not drive them out at once by giving them into the hands of Joshua.
This passage provides a very good summary of what takes place in the book of Judges, how after Joshua's death, the people turn against the Lord and turn and worship other gods, and how as a punishment he hands them over to his enemies, sometimes raiders, sometimes people who would dominate over them and extract tribute, and how when the people then turn back to the Lord. God would raise a judge for them, and this judge would come and provide them a certain level of deliverance and peace until the people then disobeyed again, and God again hands them over to the enemies. Two interesting things that you can see in this passage, which will be important as we go through the book. One is that it seems to get progressively worse. Every time it goes bad, go through the cycle, the people become more corrupt. And also, there is a sense, and we see that in verse 20, because this nation has violated the covenant. There's a sense that here the people's disobedience is at the forefront. They have violated the covenant. And therefore, the question remains, well, what is God's going to do? What is going to be God's response to this disobedience? Now, who were the judges? And to a certain extent, the terminology judges may be a bit confusing for us if we kind of think of people sitting in a court in official garb, sort of declaring who's innocent and who's guilty. Israel did not really have any sort of centralized legal system, and that kind of justice would have been administered by elders. What we call the judges are essentially people whom God raised to deliver the Israelites from their enemies. Perhaps if I was to translate it into English, the concept, you might use a language of heroes or leaders. Now, as regards some of them, we only receive limited information. So we have figures like of Othniel, Shamgar, Tola, Jer, Ibzan, Elon, Abdon. You can see almost by the references, these are quite short stories and sometimes just very brief biographical data, like they had 30 daughters who rode on 30 donkeys or 30 sons who married 30, and it's very limited what we know about them. Now, other judges received longer stories. So we have Ehud, the famous left-handed man who delivered the people from Eglon. We have the stories of Deborah. Gideon, which has a postscript, it has a whole story of his son Abimelech, who tries to raise him as a king, and Jephthah. In a certain sense, the cycle of these leaders is in the first 12 chapters of the book. Now, some may notice there seems to be a glaring omission here. Well, what about Samson? Samson tends to overlap. He is presented as leader, hero, a judge, but in many ways his actual story seems more to reflect the picture of decline and decay in the nation that we see, especially with the stories of Micah and a Levite and his concubine, which end the story, the book of Judges. So essentially, when we're thinking of judges, we're thinking of heroes that God has raised to deliver his people. So in the first 12 chapters of Judges, we can quite clearly see this cycle taking place, at least. And always three elements will be present. There'll be an element of sin as Israel abandons the Lord and follows other God. And we are then told, therefore, that God hands the Israelites over to be punished by their enemies. And it may vary who the enemy are. It can sometimes simply be that they face raids. Other times they actually seem to come under enemy domination. Now, often, but not always, there is an element of prayer present, that the people repent and they turn to the Lord in prayer. Sometimes that is mentioned, sometimes it's not. It may be implicit, or it may be that simply God, out of his mercy, decides to act anyway. And therefore, God will raise a hero to deliver his people. And generally speaking, during the lifetime of this hero, of this judge, the people will obey God, the people will experience peace and freedom from their enemies. However, although we can talk about a cycle, we might also want to reflect in terms of a spiral, a negative spiral, because there's also a sense that as we go through Judges, things get worse, especially when we look at the longer stories. As that introductory part of the book indicates, the people's disobedience gets worse. So the sense that progressively they are more disobedient. Another interesting thing that happens is that almost the quality of the hero, the judge, declines as we go through the story, especially in terms of the longer narratives. And in that sense, in many ways, even the level of deliverance that they are able to provide is lower. And we can see this actually by comparing Deborah with the two men, the longer stories that follow her story, with the story of Gideon and the story of Jephthah. And we can see that for Deborah. We start with Deborah, and the basic story, the contours of the story are familiar. She's called by God to deliver the people from the Moabites. He summons Barak and commands him to go into battle. And Barak insists that he would only go into battle if Deborah comes alongside that. And the consequence is that therefore the enemy generals, the general of the enemy, Sisera, he is not handed over to Barak, but instead he manages to escape until he is murdered by a woman named Jael. But if we look at Deborah, we can see that she's someone who's already, when she's called by God, a prophetess and leader. She's a woman who is obedient to God's word. She does what God tells her. And in fact, we see this her sort of close relationship with God in the fact that after victory, we have a long hymn, a whole chapter, which is Deborah's hymn of worship to God. And her legacy is a long period of peace. The people experience 40 years of peace. We come with Gideon. Now we see something slightly different. I mean, he does not take God at his word. The people are at the hands of the Midianites. He sees himself as being a small and important person of the smallest family. And all the way through the story, he always needs to ask God for a sign. It's never enough for God to say something. He always needs to have a sign. Now, at the end, whereas Deborah seems to have continued to lead the people, we see that he steps out of the limelight. Even after God has given us a miraculous victory, we're familiar of how he starts off with a large army and it gets whittled down until he has sort of 300 men armed with torches, and essentially the enemy turns on themselves. Gideon doesn't seem to continue in leadership. He seems to retire and just expects financial reward, a nice settlement package. His legacy is much more mixed. He gives 40 years of peace, like Deborah. But one of his last leadership things is to actually construct a golden ephod. Now, we're not sure whether this was actually initially meant to be an idol or something to encourage Israel to continue to worship God and not turn to Baal. But we are told that it became an idol. Whether that was Gideon's intention or not, we are told that it led the people astray. And his own legacy, even his 40 years of peace, are stained by the actions of his son Abimelech, which in a sense a consequence that not only did Gideon have many wives, he also had concubines. And Abimelech is a son of a concubine who actually butchers and murders 70 of his brothers and tries to make himself king. And there's essentially a civil war. And he destroys a whole city. And then as he goes to attack another city to destroy it, he is struck by a woman standing on the walls. And notice a sense that Gideon's legacy is not the same as Deborah. Rather, Deborah grants them 40 years of peace. Israel experiences 40 years of peace from its enemy, but there is civil strife and tension among the people. And then we come to Jephthah. And Jephthah's origins are rather dubious. He's the son of he's considered to be a son of a prostitute. He surrounds himself with a band of unsavory characters, and he actually does not act out of concern for the Israelites. He only intervenes when he is allowed to be head over all who live in Gilead. And although he delivers Israel from the Ammonites, he actually commits an abominable act by sacrificing his daughter. He makes this rather foolish vow that he will sacrifice whatever is the first thing that comes out of his house, and his daughter comes out. And of course, human sacrifice in the Old Testament is an abominable act. It's interesting how later on in the book of 1 Samuel, we'll see that Saul makes a similar vow. And actually, he's dissuaded from sacrificing Jonathan by the Israelites, and there's no major consequence. And there's a sense that, no, this is the quality of the leader of the Israelites is someone who offers human sacrifice. He also massacres Ephraimites, attention to do with going to the battle and who was summoned to the battle. And he actually butchers a whole thousands of people from the tribe of Ephraim. They would identify them by how they pronounce the word shibboleth. And the consequence actually is that by the time of Jephthah, we have a much shorter period of peace, 6 years. And so we can see both the quality of the judges, the leaders declining. Gideon is worse than Deborah. Jephthah is worse than Gideon. And therefore also worsening of the legacy. What should we make of Samson? And in many ways, he can be compared to James Bond. An author said he's like the Bible's James Bond. Is he one of the judges, one of this list of heroes that God used, despite their flaws, to deliver the people from their enemies? Or is he more linked to the stories of decay and corruption that we are going to see later on in the book of Judges? Now, there is a sense in which he kind of straddles both, and perhaps is a bridge between one of them. And we can perhaps see him both as perhaps a flawed and failed judge, and an illustration of the corruption in which the nation has sunk. Now, on the one hand, we look at Samson and we see someone who is arguably the most powerful of all the heroes God has raised. And his superhuman strength is one that often sticks in the imagination, and the way that this strength is somehow linked to his Nazarite vow, and the way that no razor can go touch his head. And in fact, of all the judges, he's the only one whose birth is announced by the angel of the Lord first to his father Manoah's wife, and then to Manoah himself, although the wife seems to be the much more courageous of the two. So there's all this surrounding Samson, the supernatural announcing of his birth, his superhuman strength. And yet, I would tend to have a much more negative verdict on him. I mean, we start with his character. He would not want anyone in our family or church to imitate Samson. He's impetuous, he's sort of violent, and he's actually seemed to be both smug and slightly foolish, the way that, if you read in more detail, the way that Delilah tricks him into revealing the secret of his strength. It's like, you'd have expected him to have cottoned on to what Delilah was doing. But what stands out for me is that actually throughout the story, in fact, there's 4 chapters which are dedicated to Samson, we do not see him act out of concern for his fellow Israelites. It's not that he sees the plight of the Israelites and obeys God in bringing freedom to them. In fact, many of his conflicts with the Philistines, actually, they are also around issues with women. So we have actually 2 chapters, chapters 14 and 15, and they have all to do with the issue of his wife, what happened on his marriage feast and how he was tricked into revealing the secret of the riddle, and then the fact that his wife was given to another man. And for 2 chapters, he's basically fighting with the Philistines because he feels he has been dishonored with regards to his wife. We then have a conflict to do with a prostitute that Samson was spending the night with in Gaza. And then we have this rather famous story with him and Delilah and how she tricks him by just nagging him to reveal the secret of his strength. And when he does so, he's arrested by the Philistines and he's put down to do sort of the manual labor that a woman would be expected to do because he no longer has his strength and he has his eyes taken out. And even when his strength has returned and he's in Dagon's temple, and we have this story where he kills himself along with the leaders of the Philistines, the interesting fact is, if you look at the story, he does not do this out of concern for his countrymen. He does not do this because his countrymen are suffering at the hands of the Philistines. He actually does this as a way to avenge his own blindness, a very self-centered focus. And that's why Judges does talk about Samson leading the Israelites for 20 years. Unlike other judges, it does not talk about Samson delivering them, saving them, nor the idea that they experienced peace under his leadership, as we might compare with the case of Deborah. So while he's this great, powerful, strong hero, Samson in many ways illustrates how far the people have declined. It's almost like this is the best that they can offer, and that is not enough to deliver them from the Philistines. Judges ends with 2 stories which often don't make the final cut when they're teaching about Judges, and certainly don't make the Sunday school version. And they're actually both joined together by a common factor. And in both cases, we have Levites behaving badly, not as how they should do. And both stories illustrate how low Israel has fallen. The story of Micah is often one that is glossed over. He's essentially a man who, having stolen gold from his mother, returns it, gets her blessing, and uses this gold to make idols. And then he hires for himself a Levite to act as his priest. And then as the story goes by, we see that the tribe of Dan, they, having failed to secure land for themselves, decide to procure land in the north of Israel. And as they are traveling through, they basically take the Levite away from Micah and use him to be the priest in their own cult, bringing the idols with them. And when Micah tries to demand his rights, they are quite threatening towards him. It's a puzzling tale, but it does illustrate how far Israel has fallen in its worship, and no one comes out well from his story. Micah engages in what we might call a do-it-yourself religion. He makes his own idols, has his own shrine, and then pays for a priest out of his own money. The Levite, who should be teaching people the true worship of God, abandons his vocation. In fact, he does that to become a priest. something he was not entitled to do under the law of Moses, and he therefore engages in a form of syncretistic worship. And then we have the tribe of Dan, who abandon their inheritance, the land that God has given them, and they abandon that land to look for land elsewhere. And similarly, they abandoned the true worship of God for the worship of idols. And in fact, from now onwards, the tribe of Dan will be very rarely mentioned in the Old Testament, except very generally speaking for an altar that will be set up there in the book of Kings, and an expression from Beersheba to Dan to encompass the whole of Israel. But as a tribe, it will play very little role in the history of Israel. The final story of Judges is arguably one of the most gruesome and horrific tales in the Bible. It illustrates, if the story of Micah illustrates how far Israel has declined in its worship, here we're seeing how far the nation has declined in its moral and ethical standards. And it's basically the story about how a Levite is traveling with his concubine, and he decides not to stay with the Jebusites, the Canaanites, but to stay in Gibeah, a town of the Benjaminites. But when he arrives, no one offers him hospitality, which in the ancient world is quite a horrific thing, except for an old man of the tribe of Ephraim. The reaction of the Benjaminites is to knock on the door of this man's house and ask him to send out this new guy, the Levite, so that they can rape him. And the Levite's reaction is to send his concubine out, and she suffers horrifically throughout the whole night. She's left for dead. In the morning, Levite seems to have little concern for her, just throws her on his horse. When he arrives home, realizes she's dead, and sends her body parts out to the 12 tribes, saying what has happened. The reaction of the people is to come up against Benjamin and wage war. And after suffering 2 defeats, they eventually defeat the Benjaminites, but then massacre the tribe of Benjaminite almost to the point of extinction. And to make matters worse, they have made this vow that none of them are going to offer anyone to marry the Benjaminites. And suddenly they realize that Israel is going to be down a tribe if nothing is happened. And in the end, they actually allow the Benjamites to, first by attacking a town called Jabesh Gilead, and then by raiding a religious festival, they allow the Benjaminites to kidnap young girls to marry and allow the tribe to remain. It's a story from which no one comes out well. We have the Benjaminites, who have become worse than Israel's pagan neighbors. In fact, if you were to read the story in detail about how they approached the man at the Ephraimite, it's almost identical, and the language is very similar to what happens in Sodom. And the idea here is that the Benjaminites have become as bad as Sodom and Gomorrah. In fact, the concubine would have been safer staying with the Jebusites than with God's own people. And then we have the Levite, again, a person who should be leading the people in true worship. And yet, well, you can start off with the question, why is this woman not his wife? Why doesn't she have the rights of a wife? Why is she simply a concubine? Is that the example one of the leaders should be showing? And it's evident that he shows little compassion for her. You know, the way he hurls her outside for the men to do what they want with her. He doesn't show any interest in her welfare, even when he discovers in the morning. In fact, he doesn't even offer her a decent burial, which is shocking by, Old Testament standards. Instead, he chops her body out and sends it to the nation. He's only concerned with his own honor. And then we have the people of Israel who go beyond the call of justice. They nearly exterminate Benjamin in their blood first, and with their rash vow, like Jephthah, they end up sanctioning a policy of, kidnapping and forced marriage. Israel is in a horrible state. What do we make of such a horrible ending to the book of Judges, and even to this overall very gloomy cycle of decay? Well, the book of Judges ends with a verdict. It says, "In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as he saw fit." And you can see this as a defense of the monarchy, that in fact, Israel has no central leadership. There's no one now doing the role of Moses and Joshua, leading them together towards the law, towards the Lord and subject to his law. And so we are in a situation where the nation is falling into idolatry, into anarchy, and the people are killing one another. And so in this way, we can say Judges prepares us for the coming of David, the king according to God's own heart. But at another level, this verdict, "In those days Israel had no king, everyone did as he saw fit," can be seen as a description of apostasy, that Israel has abandoned God, her true king. And in this sense, Judges prepares us for the coming of Jesus, the King of Kings. And the book of Judges leads into the book of Ruth, which tells us a story of David's ancestors, and of course points us to the greatest of all of David's descendants, Jesus Christ. How does the book of Judges fit in with God's story as we have seen it being traced across Scripture? And in many ways, the story seems to have ground to a halt. For Israel now, it is as bad, or perhaps even worse, than its neighbors. The people have turned their back on God. They have broken their covenant. Now they're killing one another, and the violence is becoming barbaric and senseless. And the question now is, well, what will God do? What will be God's response? If Israel has drawn a story to a halt, how will God make things move again to fulfill his promise to bless all the peoples through for Abraham's descendants? Because Israel does not seem to be a blessing at this point of the story. And again, we point to Ruth, because the answer is going to start in a small village in Judah named Bethlehem. And perhaps Judges stands as a strong reminder that no matter how terrible the spiritual darkness may become, God is still faithful and God is still at work in his people.